Hello, and welcome to All Things Chemical, a podcast produced by Bergeson and Campbell, a Washington, D.C. law firm focusing on chemical law, business, and litigation matters. I'm Lynn Bergeson. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with two of my colleagues, Kathy Narigon and Claire Hansen, both associates with B&C and regulatory consultants with the ACTA Group, B&C's consulting affiliate, about the complex world of end-of-life product management. We discuss extended producer responsibility, EPR, recyclability labeling claims, and plastic and microplastics regulation and liability concerns. End-of-life product management is increasingly regulated by a growing number of states, often pursuing unique management approaches that can inspire significant commercial cost and disruption. We dive into these topics and explain what they are and why our listeners may wish to monitor these initiatives, as they are complex, growing in number, and consequential. Now, here's my conversation with Kathy Narigon and Claire Hansen. Kathy and Claire, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today. I've been looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Lynn. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. Happy to be here.
Well, let's dive right in. Internally at the firm, we've been talking an awful lot lately about end-of-life product management. We recognize that it's a really big business these days. Extended producer responsibility, otherwise known as EPR in the biz, is capturing headlines for a variety of reasons, as is recyclability claims, and of course, the growing pressures that plastics and microplastics is posing on corporate America these days. We'd like to discuss all of these issues in a very compressed period of time. Let's start with EPR, Kathy. We know EPR programs are, at a very basic level, a way of shifting responsibility for end-of-life product management to upstream product manufacturers. These programs are very common in Europe, and increasingly these programs are being adopted in the United States at the state level. Maybe you can tell us a little more, Kathy, about what is EPR and in what jurisdictions are these programs starting to emerge, and what are some of the practical implications of their enactment?
Certainly. So, at a very high level, as you stated, this is a policy approach shifting responsibilities for product end-of-life management to upstream producers. And again, that is a very, very broad definition for a broad policy. So this typically manifests as a shift of financial responsibility, operational responsibility, or both, which sees producers of certain products providing funding or services to manage products when they are discarded, if those products, fall within the scope of that EPR scheme. There are a lot of examples of EPR, and a very common one that I think a lot of people don't necessarily recognize as an EPR policy is battery take-back programs. So this is an area where states will enact laws requiring producers of batteries to fund or establish collection sites or programs to ensure that those materials, those batteries, are managed properly when they are discarded, which is very interesting. But for the purposes of this conversation, we are really going to focus in on an emerging area of focus within the U.S., which is EPR related to plastic products and plastic packaging. This has really taken off in the last decade or so in the United States. The policy rationale behind these programs is that local governments and municipalities end up shouldering the costs of collection, disposal, management, and other activities associated with the end of life of plastic products and packaging, and that in turn can lead to higher costs to to the local communities and local residents. So, EPR, if it works as intended, places responsibilities on the producers of these items, and that lifts some of these costs off of municipalities and off of taxpayers in turn. Simple, right? But there,
No, not really.
there are a bunch of different requirements depending on what jurisdiction you are in, and so This following overview of how these programs work is a generalization that might vary depending on what state you are in. But in general, state programs require producers, which may be the manufacturer, distributor, or other entity of plastics or packaging, to join what is called a producer responsibility organization, or PRO, which is essentially an industry governed entity that develops the plan that sort of oversees program implementation and then manages the EPR program. So, producers who are manufacturing plastic products or packaging will pay fees to that PRO. The PRO will then distribute funds collected to cover costs of the program. This might include, making residential curbside collection programs more accessible. It might include updating program infrastructure, all sorts of different things as determined by the state legislature to promote whatever sort of underlying policy is associated with their state's EPR program. As it stands, there are 7 states that have enacted programs. Um, Oregon was the pioneer. It was the first state to sign one of these into law in 2021. Most recently, in 2025, Maryland and Washington signed EPR bills. And there are a large number of other states who have contemplated EPR programs or have put forward language to establish EPR programs that just haven't made it through Congress yet. So there are more on the horizon.
Great overview, Kathy. Appreciate that. And as you correctly noted, at some level, it sounds very simple and straightforward, efficient and elegant, and it's a really popular way, and growing in popularity way of addressing the challenge of the management of products post end of life. These are relating to commercial entities, not consumers.
Yes.
And as you note, there are programs in place now and others coming online. And I'm guessing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, that some of the programs are probably just specifically different enough so that, yes, they follow a general template, but the fee structure, the derivation of fees, the application and scope probably is just sufficiently different state to state to drive commercial entities nuts. Claire,
Uh, you are right.
yeah, it
So,
is what it is. It's a little like, PFAS comes to mind. We've talked a lot on this program about, state PFAS regulation. But Claire, what are some of the current emerging policy, practical, and legal issues that your practice, and Kathy, I know you've been participating in this an awful lot. What are you seeing out there in the real world?
Um, yeah, I mean, Kathy already kind of started to touch on a number of these points, but uh, it is something that on its face sounds relatively simple. You just want to recycle packaging products that we're already using. And you would think that most of our recycling initiatives are robust enough to be able to handle a number of the things that specifically I've looked at Oregon just because it's been the first one that's been implemented. And so we've had clients express concerns just over being compliant with that. But yeah, there is a real tension right now between environmental goals like reducing waste and improving recyclability and the economic realities of implementing these systems. Specifically, when you only have one approved PRO, which is the Circular Action Alliance, and
Mhm.
that's in Oregon, but they've also been approved in Colorado. Kathy, correct me if I'm wrong. I think they've also been approved in California.
yes.
Okay.
Well, maybe it's now is a good time to kinda dive into the litigation that we've all been talking a lot about in Oregon. How did the Oregon litigation arise? What are the basic facts, Claire? And what is its procedural posture as we speak today in late March?
Okay. So this is a really big deal piece of litigation for a number of reasons. So at a high level, the case is was brought by the National Association of Wholesale Distributors, referred to within this litigation space as NAW, v. Felden. And it involves industry challenges raising concerns about how Oregon's Public Plastic Pollution Recycling Modernization Act is structured. So that's specifically Oregon's, that's how Oregon has defined their law around EPR. Really, it has to do with how it's structured and how it's been implemented. The NAW asserts that Oregon's Plastic Pollution Recycling Modernization Act violates the Dormant Commerce Clause, the Due Process Clause, equal protection, and state law non delegation doctrines. And NAW sought a preliminary injunction to preclude enforcement of the Oregon law, and that was back in July of 2025. On February 6th of this year, the District Court of Oregon uh, enjoined that application of the EPR law, but only for NAW and its members. So uh, right now, the law still is in effect for everyone else other than NAW and its members. And then last week, the American Paper Association,
American Forest and Products,
yes,
AFPA.
AFPA,
Right.
they just filed a motion to join the litigation.
Interesting. As an intervener.
Yes.
So you have National Association of Wholesalers,
Wholesale
NAW,
distributors. Yeah.
wholesale distributors
NAW.
sought and obtained a preliminary injunction enjoining presumably the application of the fee collection for
Yes.
calendar year 2026 as to its members. And now AF and PA has filed a motion to intervene in that case. That is a big deal. When do we expect a decision?
So the case is going to court in July of this year. When they will issue a decision, it will probably be in 2026 of this year, but it will not be until later this year.
I see.
But it is really interesting because it's the first time, I think, ever in environmental law where a constitutional challenge has been brought. Specifically in this case, the court dismissed a number of NAW's claims, but it allowed their claims under the Dormant Commerce Clause and the Due Process Clause to proceed. And this was, I believe, the first time that a court granted a preliminary injunction.
Well, I would imagine for states that are implementing similar EPR statutes, largely premised on Oregon and maybe the Maryland and Washington models, people are watching this case closely. Maybe you can tell us, both Kathy and Claire, a little more about what some of the alleged constitutional infirmities are, because this will have a very chilling effect on the operation of other similar EPR statutes should the court decide that, for whatever constitutional reason, the implementation of the EPR program in Oregon is defective.
What I see as sort of the biggest hot button issue with this current litigation and potentially, issues that can be raised against other state programs moving forward is, lack of due process. The way that these PROs function as a third party private entity sort of removes them from requirements that the state regulatory bodies would have to undertake if they were directly overseeing the programs. So things like public input, public process, paths of recourse for decisions that the regulated community might take issue with. All of that is sort of a black box with these PROs. They are not required to hold public meetings. They are not required to take public input into consideration, and they are not required to provide an appeals process for issues related to fees or program implementation. And requiring a large number of producers to go along with these really, really robust and taxing requirements without any ability to have a say in that process is a big issue.
Yeah, and then Kathy, if I can just add on to that, one of the really big issues here is just that there is only one approved PRO. So,
You mean nationally or in Oregon?
so in Oregon, there is only one approved PRO. Nationally, there is no EPR regulation, which when we start talking about Europe, I can get into that. And so that just creates a whole other headache of things. But then, as I said earlier, Colorado and California have also only approved CAA as an approved PRO. So there's only one approved PRO. So the state is requiring that anyone who wants to do business in the state that may have end of life packaging products, that they have to go through these PROs. But in this case, there's only one PRO. And there's not a great through line, as Kathy said, on how these fees that these PROs are requiring to implement end of life recycling processes. And so there's a lack of transparency, and yeah, these manufacturers are having to go through, simply one organization. So um, where there could be more of attention for there to be more transparency if there was more than one PRO. That's just not the case here because there's only one state approved PRO in Oregon.
Right. Which is probably a creature of the state enabling law in each of the
Yes.
jurisdictions. So I can see the problem, and to the extent I have participated in some of the discussions relating to the issues associated with EPR, they all seem to revolve around a lack of alleged transparency with regard to the derivation of a fee. So I think each of the laws that with which I am familiar, the categories of materials that are destined for collection and processing are set forth. There's a fee associated with managing that material at its end of life, and the calculus for devising the fees per pound of each of the product categories is sometimes a bit opaque. So I can I can understand that the same Administrative Procedure Act notice and comment provisions don't apply to these PROs. But do you know, as a matter of course, if they do solicit public comment or at least additional feedback from those entities to which the fees will be sent? They're not required by law, but do they, as a matter of course? Do either of you know? That might help deal with the transparency issue, to be a little more transparent about how the fee is applied, because these programs aren't free, right? I mean, somebody's got to get rid of the materials, and CAA is in the business of dealing with these materials across various jurisdictions, and I would imagine there's some similarity to cost and derivation of the fees associated with the products that they manage.
They certainly are soliciting certain information, um, but whether and how that is changing the outcome is
Mm,
unclear. For example, um, before issuing fees in many of these programs, CAA or a different PRO, if that exists, are asking producers to send in preliminary reports to have a baseline of information to use to calculate certain fees.
mhm.
Um, but they're not, publishing a first draft and then asking for comment. So it's more solicitation of information versus more of like a formal public process that we think of when we think of program implementation or rulemaking.
Yeah, and because of the way that this program has been implemented, it's also broken up a little bit. So it's not like industry is speaking directly with the PRO or the approved PROs. It's really the industry, if they are commenting, they're going back to the state, in this case, Oregon, and if they're having a listening session or if they're having a conversation about a specific issue, and then Oregon can pass that information on to the PRO, and the PRO can choose to implement that feedback or not.
Right. Well,
So it's just that things are a little more broken up,
right.
which decreases transparency for industry, which is part of the problem.
Well, we'll start in the early days, right? I mean, this is a huge problem. How do EPR programs work? Who's going to do the work? And what is it going to cost industry to become a compliant member of a system that requires that they work with a third party independent organization to manage end of life products? So if you were working with clients in a state that has a program either implemented already or soon to be implemented, what advice would you offer those product manufacturers at this stage of the game? What should they be doing right now to be aware of the implications of an EPR program in their jurisdiction?
Claire, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Um, so first, all of these EPR laws are supposed to only target the producer. And how the producer is defined can
Probably
be a little
varies.
bit it can be a little bit complicated to determine who the producer of a specific product is. So, typically, they've taken the stance that whoever's name is on the product, they're the producer, so that's
Mhm,
kind of the most important thing. Um, but then they'll go down through a hierarchy chain. So if a big chain says to a manufacturer, "Oh, would you produce this specifically for us?" In that case, it can be a little unclear who the producer of that product is. Would it be the big chain or would it be, the actual group that is putting this product together? And some of that is going to depend just on whose logo is on the product.
mhm.
And in some of these cases, that can change, so that it'll be the exact same product. It's just a different name is stamped on the exact same product depending on where it's going. So it can get really complicated just determining whether or not you are the producer in these cases. So, number one, I'd say make sure that you are actually the producer of the product as it applies to the law,
Ensure that you're not.
or ensure that you're not.
Right,
Yeah, and then because you could be considered the producer even if you don't actually manufacture the product, but you're the importer of record,
right.
for example. So, someone over in Europe could be manufacturing something and you wanted to be able to sell it at some large um,
Retailer,
multinational
right.
store. And so you decide to import it to that large multinational store in all 50 states from Europe. So then you would be considered the producer of that product.
So it sounds like be situationally aware. If you're living in a state and doing business in a state that has an EPR on the books or one that is being implemented, anticipate, be aware of who
Mhm.
producer is, and try to engage as much as possible in the calculus on how fees are assessed, because I think that's been the real touchstone in litigation and in other issues involving the implementation of EPR programs.
Yes. So you're gonna wanna know, um, the amount of packaging that goes into a product, and that is typically calculated by pounds, and where each of your packaging falls into any of the named categories within the law. And this is, another sticking point is, all of the categories in all of these EPR laws are a little bit different.
Right.
Um,
Kathy, anything to add?
Yes. So related to situational awareness, I think just at a very basic level, staying informed. I would recommend joining industry working groups or other, groups of industry members who are facing similar challenges to sort of get your finger on the pulse of what the issues and questions are, and, there are power in numbers. The more information you have, the better situated you will be. And then at a basic level, work smarter, not harder. Look into data management systems and tools. The reporting requirements that underlie the fee calculations for these programs are really tedious and require um, producers to provide large amounts of information and often types of information that they may not have had to collect, aggregate, and analyze in this way before. And finding a good system, a good tool to sort of take part of that burden away and make data management easier, especially for states that are asking for different information or information provided in different formats. But will go a long way to making this less of a headache.
I would also urge people listening to look at our website. A lot of the information that we're talking about now, we have on our practice area EPR, citation to the Oregon case and related types of issues that we hope help readers understand the complexity of these programs, areas where states may diverge with regard to implementation of certain issues, and just a growing awareness of how important and commercially consequential these programs are, because in some instances, the fees can be pretty pricey. Well, product end of life is super complex, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, and it's more than EPR, right? Another issue is the recyclability of a product, which is a growing issue. I'd like to focus, Kathy, on California SB 343, which was enacted way back in 2021. Among other provisions, it prohibits the use of chasing arrows, an icon that we're all very, very familiar with, or other symbols of recyclability unless certain criteria are met. Kathy, why don't you tell us a little bit about SB 343 and how it relates to EPR and just the broader issue of the management of plastic waste?
Yes. So California's SB 343 is a recycling labeling bill, but at the heart of it, it is a consumer protection law. The purpose of the bill is to ensure that consumers know whether or not the products they're buying are actually recyclable,
Uh-huh.
um, which, sounds like a good thing. Um, and unfortunately, it is the case that not every product labeled as recyclable is actually recyclable, for a variety of reasons. There are certain material types that can technically be recycled, but the infrastructure or technology required to recycle that particular thing is cost prohibitive for a state, or otherwise just not economically feasible to install. There are certain product types as well that more often than not enter the waste stream contaminated, and therefore recycling is very hard for those contaminated materials. So many of the things that consumers buy, and this varies state by state too, that have chasing arrows or that say recyclable on them, will end up not being recycled. So this bill wants to make sure that if you are seeking to purchase a recyclable item, you know what is actually recyclable and what is not, which sounds great. That sounds like a really, really good thing. Consumer protection is hard to argue with. An excellent purpose for this law, right? The downside is that the requirements contained in SB 343 are in direct conflict with requirements of other states. So the California requirements severely limit what product types can include chasing arrows or other symbols or language touting the product as recyclable. And more states than not have requirements that products be labeled as recyclable or contain some sort of logo or symbol. um, Many states require chasing arrows for a wide variety of products, and California prohibits chasing arrows for all but a very small number of products. And in order to comply, across jurisdictions within the United States, um, a producer would have to make the choice of, potentially making different labels for the same product, or just not distributing and selling products in one of the states, because you can't comply with California and with states requiring the chasing arrows. They are mutually exclusive requirements. Um, like EPR, this is contributing to the growing confusion across jurisdictions for state by state programs. The sort of disjointed, mismatched requirements from one state to another, especially for producers or companies that are, selling products nationwide or internationally. It's just adding to a
Uh,
list of requirements,
Headaches.
headaches, a Lego that you step on. Just a
Well,
real pain in the neck.
I mean, some of us thought this issue was addressed at least, somewhat early on to the Federal Trade Commission Green Guides, which addresses recyclability and logos on products.
Yes.
But this provision in California and probably a host of other state provisions are, once again, just sufficiently different and distinct to make marketing products across 50 states and other locales extremely complicated. Now, is this book measure on the books now? Is it going to be litigated? Do you see litigation now or in its future? What is the disposition of SB 343?
Yes. So this is on the books. The law is not yet effective in terms of, the requirements for producers to change their labeling, but it does go into effect later this year.
Good.
Um, and whether and how um, enforcement will work is an unanswered question. It seems like a uphill battle for California's regulatory bodies to determine whether or not these requirements are actually being met, and a larger uphill battle for producers who are having to retool certain products, make big decisions about whether or not they are going to change labels or pull certain products from different jurisdictions. I foresee litigation, absolutely. In a situation where there's no win, in a lose-lose situation for producers who are trying their best to comply with a growing mountain of um, laws and bans against certain products, having something like this in direct conflict with many other states
Yeah, it's
uh,
tough.
is
It's
is
really
tough.
tough.
Yes, and it is unique. Many take EPR for instance. Many of the EPR requirements differ from state to state, but
Mhm.
there aren't necessarily direct conflicts from one state to another. And the direct conflict here is an
Yeah, it's
unavoidable problem.
well, in the time remaining, I would like to talk a little bit about plastic and microplastic, the litigation threats and just the issues that have been bubbling up for a number of years now. Kathy, maybe you can talk to us about what's going on here in the United States, and then Claire, pivot to a brief overview of international microplastics issues. So, Kathy, go ahead.
Yes. So there is a growing amount of public hubbub and regulatory conversation about microplastics. This has been growing for a while, but is really an issue that is on center stage in 2026. I believe a lot of the momentum behind this is. Public outcry about a number of studies about the presence of microplastics in the human body or in drinking water or in, other um, media that people are concerned about. And there is, there's a reason for concern about several of these issues, but a lot of this I think can be chalked up to fear mongering, where conversations about health impacts or about implications of microplastics is not yet backed by science or data. But luckily, where we stand in the United States right now, there are a growing number of federal efforts to quantify and qualify the presence and impacts of microplastics. With the growing focus on microplastics and plastics generally, and the growing number of state initiatives and federal interest in these areas as well. It is becoming more and more important to track these issues, be aware of potential litigation, and potentially new requirements that will be enacted. This really is a dynamic and fast changing space, and so awareness of these issues will be paramount to compliance moving forward.
Great. Anything different, Claire, going on in Europe or elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, so Europe is really leading the charge here, with a number of their regulations that go back to or relate to um, microplastic pollution. So the EU developed an EU plastic strategy, which identified microplastic pollution as an issue of growing concern, and then Their circular economy action plan also addressed the issue of microplastics in products and the environment. And then their zero pollution action plan provides um, re- uh, a goal of setting a 30% reduction target for microplastic releases by 2030. And then the regulation on preventing plastic pellet losses to reduce microplastic pollution, U 2025/2365, was adopted in 2025 and applies to all economic operators in the EU. And then under REACH, in 2023, the Commission adopted a restriction on microplastics intentionally added to products. So there are a number of interconnected, intertwined regulations surrounding microplastics, which are defined as like plastic molecules or fibers that are less than 5 millimeters in size. So they've begun kind of phasing out um, microplastics in the environment in various products,
Mhm.
and are phasing out, they're being phased out in food packaging, but also in things like makeup. And with the final timeline to stop, or the timeline where manufacturers must no longer include microplastics in their products by 2032, I believe. So,
So it sounds like the European Union is, in some respects, further along in diminishing, if not prohibiting, certain products that contain microplastics or the microplastic component of existing products marketed to consumers and others. If companies are doing business globally, that might have a bit of a halo effect here in the United States as you're going to be calibrating your compliance efforts to the most stringent compliance standard because it's difficult to manufacture products, one for Europe and one for the United States, right?
yes, absolutely.
And that 2030 and 2032, it sounds like they're far away, but they're not.
No, they're very soon. They're
Those
very
are
soon.
imminent, right, exactly right.
Especially as companies have to, conduct R&D to recalibrate certain formulations to make
Right,
sure that they're compliant with the laws. Then so that's just the research and development that would go into those initiatives, but then to repackage and relabel all of the products so that they can demonstrate that they are compliant, that's a whole other thing. Um, but yes, in short, the EU's scope here is much more comprehensive than the United States, not only because it's I mean, they don't have federal and state over in Europe, but these rules apply to every member of the European Union. And so, in the United States, it's close to what we would consider a federal regulation here.
right,
Because right now we're really only dealing with regulations that hit state by state. That, as we've demonstrated, I think throughout this call, that can be very challenging to
right.
implement.
And we've carefully avoided talking about microplastic litigation, which could crop up anywhere and at
Yes,
any time.
that could be its own podcast.
Right, exactly right. Well, maybe we can close out with just a couple of takeaways. Claire, you first on EPR, and then Kathy, what are your takeaways with regard to microplastics and recyclability labeling?
I think EPR is here to stay. It's definitely something that is evolving and changing, and I think that in many cases, the United States could, and maybe should, take a page out of Europe's playbook, because EPR is not new to Europe and the European
No,
Union, and one of the things that they've done really well is they've just been able to implement EPR at a much broader scope, so that you're not dealing with as many of these one-off regulations that we're kind of seeing here in the United States. But ultimately, for manufacturers, make sure that you're staying up to date on EPR litigation, developing and implementing regulations, and as Kathy said earlier, stay involved in your member groups.
yep, good advice. Kathy, what say you?
Very similar to everything that Claire just said, um, but to echo, this is a landscape where policy is changing fast and sometimes faster than science or the practical implementation of the laws that are being enacted. And this, unfortunately, is creating sort of a messy environment for compliance for the regulated community. The best thing to do to sort of mitigate confusion and to ensure that you're in the best standing possible with regards to compliance, as Claire mentioned, is just keep up to date, stay in the know, join member groups, and ensure that none of this is taking you by surprise if and when effective dates roll around that are impacting products and the ability to distribute or sell those products. This is another area where, hopefully the federal government will come around in response to the growing confusion between state programs and hopefully some cohesion through a federal requirement or federal program that preempts the disjointed and often conflicting state programs will offer some solace and some cohesion and consistency for producers. But the best you can do is stay informed.
Totally agree. And on that wildly aspirational note about federal preemptive legislation, we'll call it a day. Great thoughts. Really appreciate it. And I urge everyone to take a look at our webpage on EPR and plastics. We've got a lot more information there. Kathy, Claire, thank you so much for your thoughts. Really loved this engaging conversation on a wide range of topics. Maybe we will just focus on plastics litigation in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks again to Kathy and Claire for sharing their expertise on end-of-life management initiatives and outlining the many consequential legal, regulatory, and commercial implications of these management systems. All Things Chemical is produced by Jackson Bierfeld of Bierfeld Audio, LLC. We will be back again soon to further inform and entertain you about all things chemical. Bye-bye.